Little Sparta.
It's a bold claim. Lately, it seems like every other article about the Gulf mentions this phrase. We're doing a deep dive into what's really behind this military shift. You've been digging into this. So for years, we've seen countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar depending on Western powers for protection. But is that changing?
It's definitely more nuanced than a catchy headline. We're seeing a real shift in how these Gulf states see their global position, and their militaries are at the core of it. This reliance on the West, particularly the U.S., is being challenged. They're aiming to become major military players in their own right.
So they're not just buying the latest weapons anymore, going full DIY on their defense.
It's a multi-layered strategy. Yeah, weapons purchases are still a factor, but the ambition goes way beyond that. They're making serious investments in their own defense industries to, decrease reliance on foreign suppliers.
Makes sense. True independence means controlling your own defense. But can they really create entire defense industries from scratch? Monumental task, no doubt. However, they're taking concrete steps. They're shifting from simply importing weapons to local production. Think everything from armored vehicles to sophisticated drones, all being, designed and manufactured within the Gulf.
So this is a long game for them.
Precisely. It's about establishing a self-sustaining defense infrastructure, not just a quick fix of acquiring the newest fighter jet.
And it's not just about hardware either. I came across reports of these nations pouring resources into military education, even establishing their own versions of, prestigious war colleges. What's the strategy there?
It all circles back to this yearning for autonomy. They're focused on developing their own military doctrines and strategies, moving away from simply adopting Western models. Essentially, they want to establish their own schools of thought when it comes to military strategy.
Now, this is where it gets really intriguing for me. If they're stepping away from Western models, what direction is their military thinking taking? Are we talking completely new strategies or just modifications to existing ones?
It's a fascinating blend. They're definitely looking at successful models like Singapore's total defense approach, but they're also adapting these concepts to the unique circumstances of the Gulf region.
So is this little Sparta label something we're going to see applied across the Gulf?
The UAE is most often associated with that label, and for good reason. Their military transformation has been striking, particularly their willingness to deploy their military beyond their own borders.
Their involvement in Yemen immediately comes to mind.
Absolutely. The UAE Presidential Guard's role in Yemen, often operating with a high degree of secrecy, is a prime example.
And this Presidential Guard, we're talking about their elite force, right? Trained to the highest standard.
Precisely. They're the embodiment of the UAE's military aspirations. Trained by top-tier Western special forces, equipped with cutting-edge technology, and structured to project power far beyond their own borders.
I read about their operations in Mukalla, Yemen. It sounded like something out of a spy thriller.
That's a perfect illustration of the UAE's innovative approach to military power. In Mukalla, they partnered with local Yemeni militias, providing training and resources while maintaining a relatively discreet presence.
It seems they're aiming to influence events without a large-scale deployment of their own forces.
That's certainly one interpretation. However, it's crucial to recognize that even with this pursuit of autonomy, the UAE still relies heavily on Western expertise. They haven't completely abandoned those ties.
How does that work? If they're aiming to rely less on the West, why continue using Western private military contractors or sending officers to U.S.-influenced war colleges?
It's a complex balancing act. They're trying to modernize and develop their own capabilities, but they also acknowledge they can't fully sever ties with the West, particularly when it comes to certain technologies, training, and even strategic thinking.
It sounds like they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. Is achieving true autonomy even realistic, given these entanglements with the West?
That's a central question. And we're seeing evidence that this path to self-reliance is rockier than they might have anticipated. The UAE's experience in Yemen, for instance, has exposed some of the limitations they face.
What specifically happened in Yemen? They seemed initially successful, but then things became more complicated.
Exactly. Despite significant investments in training and equipment, achieving their objectives in Yemen proved much harder than they'd anticipated. Their reliance on local militias, who sometimes proved unreliable, led to setbacks, including the tragic loss of dozens of their soldiers in a single incident.
A stark reminder that developing a modern military is one thing, but effectively using that power in complex conflicts is another challenge altogether.
Precisely. And this isn't limited to Yemen. Their own defense industry, for example, is still grappling with the complexities of producing the advanced weaponry they need. They've even encountered hurdles with Western governments regarding technology transfers.
So this journey toward autonomy has its share of roadblocks.
Absolutely. And we haven't even touched on the impact this military transformation is having on the social fabric of these nations.
That's a crucial aspect we need to explore. We focus on the hardware, the strategies, the alliances. But what about the human element? How are these changes shaping the lives of everyday people in these countries?
It's a critical aspect that's often overlooked.
Hmm.
This push for military might has a profound ripple effect, impacting ordinary citizens. From the young men being conscripted into national service to the families grappling with the loss of loved ones in conflicts like Yemen. One of the most striking aspects of all of this is how these Gulf states are walking this tightrope between, asserting their independence and forging these new alliances, sometimes with countries viewed skeptically by the West, like Russia, China.
It's like they're playing this high-stakes game of chess, trying to balance these relationships. But how sustainable is that? Can they really cozy up to countries like Russia and China without alienating their long-standing Western allies?
It's an intricate dance, no doubt. What's fascinating is how their interactions with Russia and China are driven by very specific needs. Take, for instance, the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. The U.S. has been reluctant to provide such advanced weaponry, creating an opportunity for Russia to step in. Or consider the economic side. We see them seeking Chinese investment in projects related to their burgeoning defense industries.
So it's a strategic approach to acquiring what they need, choosing partners based on, who can deliver at any given time. But does this approach really lead to deep strategic partnerships? Or is it more transactional, focused on short-term gains?
That's a question being actively debated right now. There are indications that these relationships are evolving beyond mere transactions, at least in certain areas. We've observed joint military exercises between Gulf states and both Russia and China. There's even been discussion of establishing permanent Chinese naval bases in the Gulf.
Wow, a permanent Chinese military presence in the Gulf would definitely send ripples through Washington.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the potential risks for these Gulf states. Getting too close to Russia or China could easily provoke a backlash from the U.S., jeopardizing their security partnerships and access to, crucial Western technology.
It's a high-wire act for sure. They're looking to diversify their alliances, but they need to tread carefully to avoid overplaying their hand.
Exactly. And it's not just Russia and China they're engaging with. They're also cultivating new alliances with other regional powerhouses, like Turkey.
Yes. The relationship between Turkey and Qatar has become remarkably close in recent years.
That's no accident. The 2017 blockade of Qatar played a significant role in that. When Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain cut ties with Qatar, Turkey stepped in to provide a critical lifeline, sending troops and supplies to Doha.
It demonstrated that Qatar wasn't completely isolated, strengthening that Turkish-Qatari bond.
Precisely. They've since solidified that partnership through defense cooperation agreements and joint military exercises.
So the strategic landscape of the Gulf is becoming more complex, more crowded, with these various players vying for influence. What does this signify for the U.S.? Is America's influence in the region waning?
That's the million-dollar question fueling much debate. It's undeniable that the U.S. remains a dominant, security force in the Gulf. They have troops stationed there, engage in billions of dollars worth of arms sales with Gulf states, and provide vital intelligence and logistical support.
But as we've discussed, these Gulf states are actively seeking greater autonomy, exploring alternative options, which sometimes means looking beyond their traditional ally.
Indeed. And that's where some of the tension arises. We've seen instances where the U.S. has expressed concern about Gulf states' growing ties with Russia or China. There have even been cases of the U.S. blocking arms sales due to concerns about technology falling into the wrong hands or human rights issues.
So the relationship is evolving, becoming less predictable, perhaps even strained at times.
To a certain degree, yes. But it's important to remember the deep history of shared interests between the U.S. and the Gulf states. They share a common concern about Iran. Both desire stability in the region, and both benefit from the free flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz.
So despite these points of friction, the foundation for cooperation remains strong.
Yes, but it's a relationship undergoing a transformation. The U.S. can no longer take its position in the Gulf for granted.
A wake-up call for Washington, perhaps?
You could say that. The U.S. needs to adapt to this new reality in the Gulf, a reality where its traditional partners are asserting their independence and exploring new alliances.
We've covered these aspiring little Spartas seeking autonomy, diversifying their partnerships, and transforming their societies. It's a complex and captivating story. But we haven't yet explored the human cost of this ambition. We've discussed the hardware, the strategies, the alliances, but what about the people actually implementing these policies? The soldiers on the ground, the families impacted by these conflicts, and the broader societal changes brought about by this militarization.
That's an absolutely essential aspect of this story, one often overshadowed by the geopolitical maneuvering. This drive for military strength has very real consequences for ordinary people in the Gulf.
You mentioned national service earlier. Is that becoming more widespread in the Gulf?
Yes, it's a growing trend. Both the UAE and Qatar have implemented mandatory national service, reflecting this shift towards a more militarized society. In the UAE, for instance, all male citizens between 18 and 30 are required to serve, undergoing rigorous training and discipline.
What's the driving force behind these programs? Is it simply about bolstering their ranks, or is there a deeper societal objective?
It's more nuanced than just boosting recruitment numbers. It's about instilling a sense of national unity, of shared sacrifice, and molding young citizens into patriots who are prepared to serve their nation. It's part of a larger movement to solidify the role of the military, not just as a fighting force, but as a pillar of society, a respected institution.
So it's about shaping minds and attitudes, not just physical training.
Precisely. And the impact on these young recruits is significant. They're taken away from their families, their studies, their familiar lives, and immersed in a completely different environment. They're learning discipline, handling weapons, facing hardship. It's a crash course in a whole new way of life.
That sounds incredibly demanding, both physically and mentally. What about those who are deeply affected by the human cost of these military ambitions? The families of soldiers killed in action, especially in conflicts like Yemen.
It's a heart-wrenching reality that deserves more attention.
Yeah.
The war in Yemen, for example, has tragically claimed the lives of hundreds of Emirati soldiers, leaving families and communities devastated. The emotional toll is immense. Grief, anger, and the agonizing question of why their loved ones had to make the ultimate sacrifice.
It's a painful reminder that behind the headlines and the geopolitical strategies are real people whose lives are forever changed by these conflicts. How are these families coping?
It's a complex mix of emotions. There's profound grief, of course, but also an undeniable sense of pride. These soldiers are hailed as heroes who died defending their nation, and the government has made concerted efforts to honor them, with memorials, posthumous medals, and financial support for their families. However, no amount of recognition can truly heal the wounds left by these losses.
It's a stark reminder that the human cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield, leaving lasting scars on families and communities.
Absolutely. And this militarization is unfolding against a backdrop of wider societal transformations in the Gulf. There's a palpable shift in how individuals see their role as citizens, their relationship with their government, and their place in the world.
Can you elaborate on that? What specific changes are you observing?
One striking trend is the emergence of a new brand of national identity, one that's more confident, more assertive on the global stage, and deeply intertwined with military strength. This shift is partly a response to the aftershocks of the Arab Spring, which left many Gulf rulers feeling vulnerable and eager to project an image of stability and strength.
So it's about projecting power and unity, both domestically and internationally. But does this push for a militarized national identity come at a cost?
Undoubtedly. Not everyone buys into this narrative, and there's a real risk of alienating or silencing dissenting voices.
So there's a potential for division within these societies.
Absolutely. While some embrace this vision of strong military and assertive foreign policy, others express concern about the growing influence of the military in civilian life and the risks associated with this more muscular approach.
It's a reminder that these societies aren't monolithic, and that there are diverse perspectives on these profound changes.
Precisely. And it's crucial to create space for those diverse viewpoints to be heard and debated.
In our final act, let's shift our focus to what the future holds. What's next for little Sparta and its place in the region and the world? So we've unpacked a lot in this deep dive, from the emergence of little Sparta to the human side of this military transformation. The big question is, where do we go from here? What does the future hold for these Gulf military ambitions?
It's a complex picture, no doubt. But one thing is certain. These Gulf states are fully committed to this path of autonomy. They're determined to bolster their military capabilities, diversify their partnerships, and solidify their influence both regionally and and globally.
But as we've discussed, it's not all smooth sailing. They face challenges with their own defense industries. They're navigating this delicate dance between, traditional alliances, new partnerships, and they're grappling with the societal implications of a more militarized society.
Absolutely. And let's not forget the ever-changing geopolitical landscape. The global balance of power is in flux, with a rising China and a resurgent Russia, creating both opportunities and potential pitfalls for these Gulf states.
It sounds like we're talking about a very fluid, unpredictable situation. How do we even begin to make sense of what the future might hold?
It's challenging, for sure. But by analyzing the current trends, we can make some educated guesses.
Okay, I'm ready. Give me those insights. What trends are you seeing?
Firstly, I anticipate a continued emphasis on developing their domestic defense industries. While they won't be ditching Western weapon systems entirely anytime soon, their focus on reducing reliance on foreign suppliers will only intensify. This means investing heavily in areas like drone technology. Think autonomous drones, potentially capable of carrying out missions without human intervention. They're also likely to expand their space-based capabilities, focusing on satellite reconnaissance and advanced communication systems.
That makes perfect sense. It's about control, about not being beholden to others for their security. What other trends are on your radar?
Secondly, we can expect to see them continuing to diversify their partnerships, forging new alliances with countries like Russia and China while maintaining their ties with the West. It's a delicate balancing act, but one they're becoming increasingly skilled at navigating. They'll strategically leverage these relationships to advance their own interests, playing the field, so to speak.
So we're seeing them become more strategic, more pragmatic in their foreign policy. What about their military actions beyond their own borders?
That's my third point. I believe we'll see the UAE and Saudi Arabia taking a more active role in conflicts within Africa and the Middle East. They won't just be flexing their military muscle, but also wielding their economic influence and diplomatic leverage to shape events in those regions.
So this little Sparta model isn't just about building a strong military. It's about, strategically utilizing all aspects of national power to achieve their goals on the world stage.
Precisely. And it's an approach that's being closely watched by other nations, both within the region and beyond.
It's a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling development. But this is where I have to ask, why should the average person listening to this even care? How do these shifts in power dynamics in the Gulf affect their lives?
It's a fair question. The Gulf region might seem geographically distant to some, but its impact is far-reaching. This is a region of immense strategic and economic importance. It's a major energy producer, a global hub for trade and finance, and a focal point for, geopolitical tensions. The actions of these Gulf states, particularly as they amass more power and influence, have a ripple effect across the world.
So we're talking about tangible impacts on things like global energy prices, the fight against terrorism, even the future of democracy in the Middle East.
Absolutely. These are not isolated events unfolding in a vacuum. They're interconnected with global systems and have the potential to impact everyone. It's crucial that we stay informed, understand these changes, and recognize how they might affect our own lives.
That's a sobering thought. As we wrap up this deep dive, any final words of wisdom for our listeners as they try to process this complex topic?
I think the key is to approach this with a sense of humility. These Gulf states are complex, dynamic societies, and we should be wary of imposing our own assumptions or biases on them. It's about listening, understanding, and engaging in thoughtful dialogue.
That's excellent advice. We need to prioritize understanding the perspectives of those within the Gulf, fostering respectful conversations about the future of the region, and recognizing that their story, like the global narrative, is still being written.
Exactly. History isn't set in stone. The choices these Gulf states make in the coming years will ultimately shape their own destiny, as well as the future of the region and potentially the world.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this fascinating exploration of Little Sparta and its implications for the Gulf and beyond. We hope you've gained some valuable insights into this complex and ever-evolving landscape.
It's been a pleasure sharing my perspectives with you today.
And to our listeners, we leave you with this final thought to ponder. In an increasingly multipolar world, can these Gulf states truly forge their own path as little Spartas? Or will they find themselves forever tethered to the very powers they're striving to break free from? Only time will tell.